All right, I went ahead and started the recording. So, Tim, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
I will get started here shortly. Okay, here we go. Good afternoon, everybody. So you are all here because you work for AAAs in the state of Washington. And AAAs have contracts in place with DSHS around this work we do. So this training is going to touch on the planning part of that. And each AAA manages a 701 plan, and they also have a couple of other plans that they manage, their area plans, etc. Okay. So what you should come away with this training, take away from it rather, is tribes are governments. They're not stakeholders. Yeah, please keep yourselves muted. I should be the only one talking here. Hey, Karen. So tribes are partners. They're governments. They aren't stakeholders. And if you ever tell them that they aren't a meeting, they'll let you know all about it. They do that. So they do have contracts. They got tons of contracts with the state. And so there's a huge body of work that takes place. And so the reason I'm opening with this thought is we have the business that we do together. Sometimes it's tedious. It's all revolves around policy, law. We are bureaucratic in nature. We're intrusive. So all these pieces are reality, and it's because we don't just have authority to do whatever. We're the payer of last resort. The buck stops with us. The liability also stops with us. So there's a give and take of realities that we all work with, and so that's just all part of this whole framework. So with that, yes, tribes are sovereign governments. They're also a race, and I'll talk about that too. But also in this, the state is sovereign as well. Goes both ways. And if my PowerPoint works, we will get through it. Sometimes it gets sticky, old machines and so forth. So I am Tim Collins, and I'm the Senior Director at the DSHS Office of Indian Policy. Through RCW 43.376, I am named as the Tribal Liaison to the Centennial Accord mandate, which is at RCW. And I have peers in every agency that have a similar responsibility. And so this is our role here in state government. I manage the Office of Indian Policy. I have 4 regional managers. I have an admin support staff, and I also have a contracts coordinator. And so here in front of you, this slide, you see the tribes in Washington State, 29 federally recognized tribes. There's no state recognized tribes in Washington. We are not in the business of recognizing tribes. We follow the lead of the feds. And so whatever comes down to us from the feds, that takes precedence over state law and whatever else. Unless we get into a situation where we put the 10th Amendment on the table. And I'll talk about that too. I have a slide for that. Those little highlights down there, you see bold indicates tribes. Italics indicate recognized American Indian organizations, or RIOs for short. So here in Washington State and with DSHS, we work with 29 federally recognized tribes dispersed through 3 DSHS regions. Those are all listed there. And then the RIOs, those are nonprofit organizations. And because of the termination period, working with tribes, the feds, a number of tribes were terminated long ago. It was an experiment, yet another experiment they embraced to assimilate tribal citizens that failed miserably. But the outcome of it was we had tribes being eliminated, terminated, ended as governments. One or two of them came back, but most of them didn't. And so we had thousands of natives going to the urban centers. And so that's a reality we work with today, especially in Seattle. And so we'll talk a little bit on that too as we go through this. This is my team here, OIP. So these ladies are the points of contact in the regions. And if you're working with tribes in any of the regions, these women have their fingers on the pulse of the tribes. So you have to make use of them. You can certainly reach out to me and I'll help you, but typically I'll connect you with one of these ladies and they'll help you with whatever you're trying to overcome. So OIP fits in right here. We were born in 1991 through RCW 43.376. And also, as I go through this today, because I'm thinking about it, I'm going to be bouncing around. Some of it may seem redundant, even repetitive. I do that on purpose. It's because I want all, there's key points I want everyone to understand. And it's so, if it hits you 2 or 3 times, you say, oh, I just heard that. It must be important or something. And actually, actors do this when they act. They make them say their lines over and over again. And then when they go in and edit and put it all together, it's supposed to make sense. But, you know, who knows, especially in comedies. Anyhow, so OIP, born in 1991, fully staffed. And at that time, Goya was alive and well, Governor's Office of Indian Affairs. And at that time, they had about 4 staff. Now they have 2. So for DSHS, we started this adventure, this journey into tribal liaison country. So after 1991, all the administrations at DSHS, the divisions, even headquarters got involved. They started creating all these tribal liaison positions. So now today we have about 300, or we have 100 liaisons in each region, tribal liaisons, contract managers, 701 plan managers. They're all doing this work. So they're in place. As I said before, we work directly with the tribes and RIOs. We are the bridge between the state and those entities. And in this case, AAAs. We do manage the 701 policy. So the managers working in OIP, they are mandated to oversee that, to manage it, to schedule it, to be present during meetings, to participate, to bring me information. All of that happens. Moving on, we work with state partners, especially around social services work. And so near the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you a slide that talks about the future and that reality, because as of 2016, the whole 701 platform that we use was scooped underneath, lifted up, and placed at the governor's level. And so today, we work directly, social services providing programs, that's departments, DSHS, corrections, commerce, DCYF, healthcare authority, and DOH. So this body of work now, we meet with the governor twice a year. And one of those is during the Centennial Accord, but that's huge. And so I'll talk a little bit about that model too. And then of course, we're totally woven into DSHS. We're just everywhere that we can be. So, yeah, we like getting into, we use pictures. You're gonna see lots of pictures here. You're gonna see lots of history. I'm painting a backdrop, historical backdrop that says, well, this is why we're here and why we do all this. So I hope that helps. So here you have the Borg, and gee, you have some guy over here with this nose that they don't have the same nose, so that's not uncommon. Anyway, let's just cut to the message. So Nicholas that's Pope Nicholas. And they didn't have cameras back then, so they painted his picture. That was 1455. And so as Pope, he was one of these, I guess, warrior popes, because they were all about conquering everybody and putting them under their thumb. And so the parallel to the Borg is they assimilate. That's what this is about. It's assimilation, by the way. So what comes out of Pope Nicholas, it starts with him really. It's called the doctrine of discovery, the principle of discovery. Now, this is interesting because today the doctrine of discovery is still cited in the Supreme Court in its decisions around land use. That's the most recent one, involved the Suquamish tribe back in the 90s. But it's still going on. That's wrong. You know, so looking at the history some more. This is 1452, 1455. So Nicholas is talking about the doctrine of discovery, the right to conquer. 1763, you see the proclamation line. This is what divided Canada and the United States, really. And then 1778, 1763 through 1778, you know, clear up to 1800. This was a very interesting period for the United States because it was before we became the United States. And so the founding fathers they were walking around figuring out, you know, how this country was going to look, what it was going to do after it broke away, because that's what they were headed towards. So they're reaching out to tribes to basically partner with them, just like we do today. And so the method for nations talking together involved treaties. And so from the very beginning, tribes were approached with treaties, and they signed them, and so they're recognized as governments. That's where that reality began. So the Delaware Nation was promised 2 seats in Congress, and of course that didn't come about when it was all said and done, but the consideration was there. So going back to the papacy and these dates, take a moment and read through this because it's critical. So we have Pope Nicholas, and we have Alfonso, and he was the ruler of, I believe, Spain. Yeah, at that time. And so, you know, this is what happened. You see what happens. Here's the next one. So we have 1452, 1455. Alfonso and Pope Nicholas, they're looking at slavery. They're looking at assimilation. They're also looking at bringing workers. Okay, but also what's really amazing is these European monarchs, they were looking to be anointed by the church. That the ultimate goal was to be the emperor anointed by the church over everything. And so these rulers, these monarchs, were trying to curry favor with the church through that process. Indigenous peoples across the world, from Africa to the United States to the Americas overall, really, they became pawns in these behaviors, slaves, and worse too. So here is that anointed part. We make a point, depute to you and your said heirs, successors, heirs and successors, lords over all, with power, authority, and jurisdiction. We all understand that word. So we have some more. So we have to keep in mind these were rulers too. These were leaders in their times. And I say times because we're going back and forth between 1455. Now we're back at 1770s. There's George Washington. with his view. We have Thomas Jefferson expressing his view. And so the reason also I bring this up, this history is critical, is we are sitting here in 2022. Tribes haven't forgotten this. This has been handed down through oral tradition since it happened. So we're going to talk about some dates. Now, as I'm talking, you have a question, don't worry about interrupting and asking the question. Now, I can't see the chat, so you can put it in there or you can just chime in and someone will nudge me to stop and I'll answer it. That's not an issue. So let me know. And we've got a comment right there. No, I don't share PowerPoint slides. People have used these presentations to get master's degrees, and this belongs to DSHS. So take good notes or come back to me afterwards or my staff. We're all well versed in this. Okay, so these dates, 1776, we declared our independence, but that was just a declaration. They didn't finish the Constitution until 14 years later. So they had to figure out what it was they were going to do. The Jay Treaty extends from east to west. It's a Canadian border. And that Jay Treaty talks about going back and forth between the United States and Canada. So Canadians can do that. They can come over and then they can go back. Their version of a legislative body endorsed that treaty. They embraced it. Ours did not. It was not ratified by us. And so what that means is I could take my tribal ID and I could cross the border into Canada, but I would have some problems getting back. And so that's that reality. Fortunately, I have my cool Washington State ID card that's, lets me go across the border, so it doesn't matter, but just making the point. Okay, so moving on, we see 1823, 1831. So that was like a 7 to 8 year period. And so it says Doctrine of Discovery, Domestic Dependent Nations. So this is where the first series of court hearings took place in the Supreme Court around the Doctrine of Discovery. And so Chief Justice John Marshall, his court had to define tribes and what they really were in this framework. So we have the oversight of our powers at the highest level. Today we do. We understand it. So we have the court. The courts define, they rule. Congress passes, or they write laws, they draft them. The executive signs them, and then they oversee the whole ball of wax. So loosely, that's how it should work. So during this period of 1820 to 1835, John Marshall was the Chief Justice. Andy Jackson was the president. Andy Jackson didn't care for natives. He forced the Trail of Tears to take place, which removed natives from southeastern United States to the Oklahoma territories. A lot of that journey took place over the winter, and hundreds to thousands of tribal people died horribly. And it was like a sideshow. People would gather, they'd watch them walk by and jeer at them and laugh at them as these people struggled. And so that was going on. And so John Marshall was left to define the situation of the tribes. And so the Doctrine of Discovery was reviewed, those papal bulls, and all the information. And his ruling was that tribes had been imposed upon, and they didn't ask for any of this. That being said, though, they were effectively nations within a nation, domestic dependent nations. Okay, so today every tribe that exists is known as a domestic dependent nation. So real quick, we'll take a minute, and here's where I am watching the comments. Can you tell me of, 5 other domestic dependent nations in the current framework of United States government reality, the feds? And I'll give you a freebie. One of them is Guam. So go ahead and you can type right in the chat if you want, or you can just say it. Puerto Rico, excellent. That's one of them. American Samoa, excellent. Thank you, Autumn. Yeah, American Samoa, Samoa. Thank you, Don. Now, if you get the last one, you get a gold star. No? Marshall Islands, okay, yeah. The last one is Washington, D.C. So D.C. was, it was envisioned to be the capital of the nation. They spent a lot of time planning that city out. They, even down to where it was located, but also how it was designed, how it looked. All of that was pre-planned. And so DC has been overseeing everything we do since our birth as a nation. And so right now, and maybe it already burned up in the Congress's processes, but they were talking about DC being a state. And this has come up, periodically through our history. Personally, I don't see it happening. And the reason is, it's all this research. We're always tracking what goes on. So there's kind of a feel for this, but DC they've been overseeing all of this, the whole ball of wax since the beginning. So for them to become a state, that would lower them to the level of other states. They would be competing for the same resources and considerations. And now they don't have to fight for that. So I just don't see it happening, but who knows? Otherwise, why didn't it happen before now too? That's the other piece. Okay, so going through the rest of this, 1868, 371 treaties signed. Why is that significant? Well, there was over 800 drafted. So less than 400 were ratified. That's what that means. And honestly, all the treaties were broken at one point or another. 1871, formal end to treaty making. They were replaced with executive orders. So the difference between them, people say, is nothing. I don't agree with that because executive orders can be amended, revised. They can even be canceled out, concluded. For treaties they are the law of the land. They're legal documents. They've been signed by leaders. Okay, moving on, if it'll let me. Here we go. Okay, here we have, now these are the 4 periods of working with tribes, tribal governments. In each one of these periods, there were activities going on that were profound, and they impacted the reality of tribes moving forward to when they ultimately became federally recognized. So a lot of the behaviors we see here, they drove what took place with tribal governments being formed, and then ultimately the creation of tribal self-determination, which is alive and well. So these dates are critical, and the information in this presentation reviews them. So here we're going to talk about a period that's sad, and what I say is, don't personalize it. I don't. It's an ugly part of our history, and this is just what we had to deal with. So these handcuffs were used for children. Children were forcefully taken away from their families and put in boarding schools. and that was a horrible experiment. It was wrong. Okay. So in Washington State, we had some of these boarding schools in place. There you see down there at the bottom, Chehalis, Skokomish, Makah reservations. Tulalip had a school. It closed in 32. And then Cushman had another one. They closed in 1920. These boarding schools were the places where Indian children were they were reformatted. So they all traces of their identity were driven out of them. They were punished for speaking their languages. Captain Pratt was the founder, and he saw Indians as just really manual laborers, not much more. So they wouldn't be capable of leading. They'd be good for sweeping floors, picking up garbage, that kind of thing. So his view was to kill the Indian and save the man. Here we see some before and after pictures. So these children would be forcefully taken away, haircut, clothes, given uniforms, and forced to speak English. They had to learn English. They couldn't speak their native tongues, sing their songs, do their dances. As it turns out, most of these children didn't return home. Those that did come home, they'd been reprogrammed. So they didn't know anything, and they weren't recognizable. So they were ostracized, really, in the communities. And what we've been learning recently within the last couple of years is many of these children died horrible, tragic deaths, stemming from abuse and other atrocities, really. So there's mass graves. We see gravestones in that picture in the upper left, but there are mass graves with no marking. They were discovered. It started in Canada, but it's made its way to the U.S. And this is where these boarding schools were located. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, has formed a committee, and so they're investigating this in the U.S. And started with 300, now it's up to thousands, and unfortunately, they're going to find thousands more. So it's a sad chapter. And for us in the here and now, yeah, we see that it's sad, but tribes are they're grieving. So they are getting these remains if they can figure out who they are, and then they're ceremonially interring them back on the res today. So moving on. Sorry. Moving on. I was talking earlier about the termination era of the United States. And so when that took place, that was during the 50s and early 60s, really. So we saw tribes being terminated, and the tribal citizens then were moving to the urban settings to become American citizens, really. So San Francisco, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, New York, Seattle, and here in Washington, Spokane, and Tacoma as well, they bustled with these populations. And so in Seattle today, we have about 25,000 tribal members, give or take, from 475 federally recognized tribes. So those citizens reside there. In Spokane, it's about I'm thinking it's 15,000 or so, and there's about 30 tribes. Or no, I'm sorry, 300 tribes, and similar to Tacoma. So we have this in place. And what it comes down to then is these folks are enrolled with their respective tribes, but they still access services as tribal citizens. And as we do our jobs here in state government, we run into situations, especially around auto enrollment when programs are created. So we've had some struggles with that, but these are real outcomes I'm talking about of massive movements that have taken place in the past, and it's impacting the realities of today. Moving on, I mentioned this earlier. So treaty tribe, executive order tribe, what's the difference? Actually, it was about 6 months when they drafted this change. Took place in the 1870s. And as I noted earlier, treaties, I think, have more power because they're signed by leaders, endorsed by leaders, where executive orders can be rescinded or revised entirely. So, okay, we're going to go through some policies, laws. And so going back to, let's see, going back to 1934. Oh, that's right. It was that. So I was showing you those periods, right? 1934 was one of them. So 1934, 1924 was when natives became citizens, finally. So an act was passed. It made tribal members citizens of the United States. And we sit here and we say, well, why did it take so long? Well, as I noted at the beginning of this, Delaware was promised 2 seats in Congress, and at that time they were a big tribe, so they had a presence, right? So the founders at that time they had these thoughts going through their minds, but it just didn't work out, and so tribes weren't involved. They weren't named in the Constitution, well, sparingly, and they weren't given those seats. And so the idea was tribes were not subject to the Constitution because they were governments, okay? And so when the ruling came from the Supreme Court years later in the 1820s through 1830, still that recognition didn't come in. And what it came down to was because they didn't pay taxes. After the Civil War, we see African Americans, Black Americans becoming citizens. Well, they were paying taxes as they worked. And especially when the tax piece came along, it was really embedded. So those changes all occurred. And for tribal members, 1924. So 1934, we had the Indian Reorganization Act. And this set the stage to create tribal governments. It didn't really take root until after World War II. And that's because we had thousands of GIs returning from the war, and they were familiar with the bureaucracy of the military because they had to be trained and follow those laws and rules as soldiers. So we see these soldiers returning to America, to the United States after the war. Among them were tribal members who went back to their reservations, their settings, and those became the leaders of tribes. So they embraced the IRA. The tribal governments were established, so they started bringing in resources to help their communities, to help their citizens. So that created the need for more policies, social related policies, to provide services. Of course, we're talking after the war, and then after the 60s with termination into the 70s and 80s, we started seeing some of these acts passed. So 638, and that's 1970, that's the all-encompassing contracting act. And tribes have used this for a swath of programming. Some of it is construction, building infrastructure, law enforcement, education, courts, pretty much you name it. They've been using it for that purpose, and it's worked really well. And programs, treatment programs, elder programs, etc., so forth. The Alaska Native Claims Act, 71. This is where Alaskan villages became corporations. So they were they were recognized tribes called villages. That's their term. And they set that aside to become corporations. And, you know, corporations last forever. What comes out of that is these corporations have contracts across a broad spectrum, and they have a presence across the world. One contract I know about is with NASA. Another village, it has hotels located in lots of places. Oregon, they have a huge hotel, and so they're in that business, you know. So it just depends, but it's active, and the drawback to it that I've heard from Alaska natives born after 1971 is they have no standing, because that part was eliminated. They were no longer recognized. They were corporations. So that's a significant change that came from that. Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. This is hopefully woefully underfunded, hopelessly woefully underfunded. So they run out of money every year, and those tribal members, tribal citizens receiving services, guess where they have to go? They go to the state. You know, it's just part of that reality. So tribal leaders consistently, constantly advocate for this to be better funded, and really, through history, it's been cut more than it's been bolstered. So that's a reality. 477 Act. So tribes use this for training centers, providing training, education, job searching. We know them as TARO programs. You may be familiar with that. You may hear about TARO coordinators with tribes. Well, these are the federal programs that they manage, they oversee. And for DSHS, we see a lot of partnering connections between this TARO and TANF. So that there's stuff that goes on there. Here we go. Here's another profound thought. So treaties were drafted, put in place, and as I noted earlier, there was just under 400 that were ratified. And so in the treaties, we're talking about the rights of tribes, tribal rights, tribal governments. So, but the whole idea is when we've approached tribes to sign a treaty, the treaty lists what the tribe retains. So it's a granting of something from the tribe to us. It's not the other way around. We're coming to the tribes with our hat in our hand. That's the reality. All right, this clause, there's two major clauses. This is the big one. And I've had tribal leaders talk to me about this. So honestly, this is where, per these leaders, state governors, legislative folks, legislators, judges, police officers, education, teachers, just everyone across the board. They should be aware of this, and they should raise their hand and swear allegiance to it. And this comes from tribal leaders. And so really what it's saying is Constitution is the law of the land, and that means treaties are as well, plain and simple. The Commerce Clause, it furthers this whole idea of sovereignty. We're talking about sovereignty. You know, tribes are sovereigns. Congress has the power to regulate commerce for nations, states, tribes. Those are all sovereigns, all of them. Okay, moving on. Federally recognized tribes. Now, this is saying that tribes are governments. Yeah, tribes are a race. And we see that tracked in the census. You know, among the best practices types of folks, they talk about races in their, as they look at their lists. Yes, tribes are a race, but the government works with tribes as governments. And it's because of this, what happened with discovery. You know, they discovered tribes here, and then they colonized the United States. That's what started this whole thing. And as I said at the beginning, the state is sovereign too. The U.S. is sovereign. So the feds, they're overseeing everything. They're in charge. They're intrusive with their rules and laws. They have to be. And so they look to the security of the nation. That's their place. They ensure that. States are focused on their populations, their citizens, keeping them safe, focusing on their well-being, continued and extensive, really. And we go over to the left side of this. So this, the 10th Amendment. So this is where the states can tell the Fed, and they do. We're invoking this, and we don't agree with you. It goes against our sovereignty. So we've seen this. Now, I am educated and trained as an urban and regional planner. And the areas that I focused on and that specialized in are tribal planning and community development. So what we learned in that program, and it's a nationally accredited tribal planning program over at Eastern Washington University. And so what we learned in there, what we were trained around to understand is states see themselves as the only sovereigns by and large, and tribes aren't sovereign. And they've always challenged that. And depending on which state you're in, it's even worse, you know, like the Dakotas, just saying. Here in Washington state, though, it's different. Washington state is praised by other states, by the feds, and other tribes across the nation for what they have created with tribal governments, the relationships. And so as I talk to you and share this history with you, we have to keep that in mind. Because DSHS has taken that whole concept and they've taken it a step further and higher. And so they've had a relationship with tribal governments for over 30 years, and they've been a leader in building this framework that we have today in the state of Washington. So that's pretty cool. We're going to talk about some legal activities. So Executive Order 13175, signed by President Bill Clinton, says you shall consult. Do tribes invoke the 10th Amendment? No, tribes do not. That doesn't apply to tribes. Tribes are sovereign, so they invoke their own stuff. And they come at the feds in numbers through National Congress of American Indians, through their power to vote. That's a good question, though. And the other part of that question is, there have been times when we are sitting together challenging the feds around the decisions they make, arm in arm with tribes. We're sitting next to each other, facing them across the table. That's pretty cool. Do any U.S. tribes governments have agreements, relationships with with other countries outside of the U.S. that are independent of the U.S. government? Now that is an excellent question, and so I would say no, but I also say yes, and that's because tribes, as governments, are always trying to build up what states work on through their efforts. And so as I noted in that slide just a minute ago, states are focused on the well-being of their citizens, where the Fed is focused on security and the nation, right? Well, so tribes, there are tribes that, like Tulalip tribe has the city of Tulalip. So it's a city, okay? Which drives Marysville nuts because of the taxes they don't get to tap into. We have that reality. We have tribes, there's tribes that are so rich, they have their own bank, you know, so they then work outside of the nation. They have these relationships, they do have relationships with other countries. So that does go on, and that's around, you know, the commerce piece, but the piece that comes from the Constitution, which thank you for this question because it brought me back to that. And I should have shared this when I was on that other slide. Federal law grants sovereignty to federally recognized tribes. It is not the equivalent to foreign nations. As the U.S. has nations within a nation, that's what this says. Tribes can only make treaties with the United States. Thanks for that question. That was a good question. Thanks for reminding me too. Okay, so moving on. So President Clinton issued this executive order, and it's historical because it gets cited by other presidents. And so really what it is, he was telling his departments, you will have consultation and coordination plans with tribal governments. So every president has supported this idea. And we get to Biden when he took office January last year, and he was so he sent a memo to his directors in his departments, just like our assistant secretaries, really. And so he told them, I'm looking forward, among all the other things he's shared, but he says, I'm looking forward to reading your 13175 plans. And when I saw that, I got warm inside. I thought, wow, that's cool. Because I knew what it was. So moving on. Oh, we have another comment. Hold on a second. What do you attribute to 1871 and for formal treaties? I don't understand your question, John. This was decided by Congress and the president at that time. And so really, Congress wanted to, they didn't like the treaties being in place. And the executive branch actually agreed with them then. And so that's why they ended the treaties, because they're legal documents. They really are. That's a good question.
Tim, there is another issue about that. That was about the time that U.S. became a corporation.
Yes.
Grant signed to sign our debts. So is that what you're linking it to?
I'm not going there with you guys.
Okay. Thank you.
That's a good question. Thanks. Okay. Right on. We got some people that are challenging me. I love it. Thanks, you guys. Okay, so 89. First Centennial Accord took place. And leading up to this, tribal leaders had been working with the feds, self-determination, full faith and credit, having their orders recognized. Just all of these tedious types of things, but they're really important to governments, And so the accord was scheduled, and so the idea behind it was these tribal leaders were saying, okay, we're doing this work with the feds and it's important and it's bearing some fruit, but we still have the states, and we have to have a presence in Olympia. This was the tribal leaders from Washington talking to each other. Melton Ascot, see, we had the chairman over at Quinault. His name's right on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, Joe Dela Cruz, there he is. So these leaders back then were wanting to really expand their infrastructure, their tribal infrastructure, their governments. So in that accord, that first accord, governor got together. They spoke about collaboration, cooperation, consultation, just working together, extending full faith and credit to tribal programs, tribal court orders, recognizing their law enforcement, their courts, their schools, etc. Everything under the sun. So governor meets with tribal leaders in 89. Kalispell and Yakima Nation didn't sign it. The others did, though. And so they agreed to those principles. And so what we had here, this is 1989, we had this request, we had a promise made because the governor and tribal leaders promised each other to do those things, drafted it, signed it. Governor turns to his department directors, secretaries, and tribal leaders turn to their directors from their programs, and they said, you're going to do this now. You're all going to do this together. So what we have there is we have a request, a promise, and then a directive. You go down to that fourth bullet, 1987, 2 years before this, DSHS American Indian Administrative Policy 701 is created. So that was the promise in 89. In 87, 2 years before that, our policy is the method by which we measure that promise. We monitor it, we manage it, and it works across the board. So that's a profound reality. And DSHS has just been there at the beginning with this. So 99, you got the Millennium Agreement. We add 3 tribes, make it 29. And every year we've had the Centennial Accord take place. So we've revisited our commitments, and we've also talked about what we're doing. We do this every single year. These other milestones, contract consolidation, that went away. And what it did is it streamlined our contracting method, but it went away after 2016 because of movement to Healthcare Authority DOH from DSHS. DBHR moved. DCYF was born. So Children's and JR moved over to join them. And it created more silos. And I'll talk more about that. That's coming up in a future slide. But along with that, contract consolidation died, really. Just too bad. Because that allowed tribes to get all of their contract funds up front and spend them down during the year and just report out. That's a federal model, really, that goes to tribes. But it's because they're tribal governments, so they give them the resource, the money, without having stringent tracking requirements, even though they exist. But for state government, when we receive funds to pass through to tribes, we're still responsible to report out on it and track it. And that's why we have these rules in place. It's just the way it is. So anyway, moving on. 2011, Washington State Indian Child Welfare Act. So that supported, filled in, bolstered the federal ICWA, which is pretty cool. Passed in 78. So this 2011 act has taken it even further, and we're pleased with it here in the state. It's doing great things. In 2019, creation of the Tribal Leaders Social Services Council. And as I noted earlier, this had to do with all the breaking away, the movements in 2016 and 17. And so today, tribes around social services issues meet with the governor twice a year. And that's what it's accomplished in a nutshell, which brings issues to that level that we can change. If we can't change something or fix something with the authority we have through our work groups, then it elevates up to the governor and tribal leaders level, and they address it then through legislative fixes or whatever they have to do at that level. So it's quicker. This is the codification of the Centennial Accord, Chapter 43.376. And we do all of this stuff as noted there. The elements listed on the left in that column, those are the principles we follow. So this is all listed on Goya's website. Just Google them. You're inspired to look at it. Institutionalized government to government procedures. That's what it is in a nutshell. I didn't tell you, but I resurrected this presentation. It's an old one, but it's comprehensive. And when we've moved to digital trainings, we condensed our training. but because this is a unique group, I guess, AAAs, I'm going through the whole 9 yards, because if we do it the other way, then you have to do a prereq before you do the heavier training, the larger one. So we had to do away with that. These are planning terms, usual and accustomed areas. This is where tribes live today, or no, where they used to live, where they migrated, they lived out their lives, they had their cultural areas. We see a lot of this listed rather in tribal comprehensive plans, but I've never seen one that they only show those to tribal members of a given tribe, because they look at 7 generations, not a single generation like comp plans do with counties. These other ones stand out: trust land, communally held land, allotment lands. This map. Yeah, we deal with maps. So here we see a map. It has four distinct areas, districts really. And it's Confederated Tribes of Colville. So why do we have these maps? Well, this is a reality for tribes, and it's part of the granting system from the feds. So they would get funding requests. This was during the 70s, and so what Reagan did, President Reagan, is he flipped this around. So they were talking about funding requests going to the Fed. They would put their packages together and forward them state by state. And what happened with this was tribes were grouped where they lived. So instead of the tribal governments working directly with the federal government, when this change took place, community development block grants. Sorry, I was trying to remember that term. So this is what the feds, it's one of their mechanisms they use, and tools for funding, really. So these community development block grants during Reagan's time, what he did is he had the states submitting these packages to the feds to consider, just like the governor does when he goes through the annual budget exercises, right? So the states then were having municipalities and localities gather up the information, send it up the chain to county governments, who would send it to the feds. Tribes were put in at this municipal level. So they were knocked down from government to government directly with the feds down to these municipal levels. And tribes have had a turbulent history with county governments. They've struggled with them. Hasn't been nice. So this is one of those lessons we learned, those historical lessons. And the Colvilles, they're right in the middle of it historically. So Colville tribes, Confederated Colville tribes have 4 districts located in 2 counties. So right down the middle here, 2 of these are in one county, the 2 on the right are in Stevens, I think. And so it creates all kinds of political turmoil internally. So with each other, tribal districts with each other, tribal districts with the county, and then of course the state, but mostly with the county. So we share this in this training, so folks are aware of it. It's always a challenge. Here's another map. So what we have here is we have tribal groupings, and so these aren't just tribes, but we have it grouped by language, and then we have them broken down by different tribal divisions. And so what you see above in that first map, Sahaptin speaking peoples located mostly in the southern part of Washington, across the board there. And the rest are Salish, excuse me, with the exception of the Kootenays. They don't speak Salish, they speak Kootenai. But all the other tribal folks' names you see there, Okanagan, which is Okanagan, Sinhumanesh, Spokane. The old name for Spokane is Skat, which is fast water. Skeechuishim, that's Coeur d'Alene. And Kalispell, it's Kalispa. So those are all Salish speaking folks. So that's the language grouping breakdown. And then down below, you see the different bands. Columbia, Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, Kalispell, Kootenai. Blackfoot, that's Canadian. So that's where you see that boundary extending down into the United States. Tribes don't know the lines that are in place. Tribes are familiar with usual and accustomed areas. Alluvial peoples near the water. So you see these breakdowns, and that's why it makes sense too, through tribal logic. There's another old map. It's a goodie. It shows the reservations back in the day and seated areas. So you see this whole piece right here. This was Yakima. And of course, it extends down into Oregon. So we don't see that part. And then up here we have Colville's. Well, that's their little piece there, but it extends clear up into Canada. Lots of peoples. Contract health. I always show this slide. Those should all be yellow. I don't know why they aren't, because tribes are located clear across this state. But as you look at this breakdown, so these are where, through the contracts, tribal members reside and they're receiving services. So Samish Nation extends, Whatcom, Skagit, Snohomish, clear over here into San Juan's, Clallam, Jefferson. So there's a lot of folks living across the board here, and the tribes provide the services through their contract health. IHS, and you could even look at that through the 638 lens, by and large. This should be familiar to everybody. This is DSHS after it restructured in 2011 to 3 regions. Who is an American Indian? And we are good at defining everything under the sun. So tribes are sovereign. They are 3-part citizens of the tribe, state, and the United States. Difference between Alaska Native American Indian, there's none. But as I noted earlier, their status has changed to worldwide with those corporations with that presence. All right, we should move fairly quickly here now. So we are involved in the 701 process, and this history I've shared informs that. It has brought us to what we're doing now. It's also illustrated this relationship, this powerful relationship that's been in place for decades, that goes beyond all the legal stuff that we observe through 4.3.376 and our policies overall. So focus of 701, it is around consultation, recognizing tribes as governments, and collaboration with RIOs. So the difference we should note here. Tribes are governments, they consult. So they have consultation as part of their framework. RIOs are not governments, they cannot consult. They can collaborate, they can advise, they can confer. Years ago, I had one of the RIOs reach out to me, and we had just terminated an MOU they had with one of the administrations. It was a mistake that had been made years earlier. So we were looking at that and discussing it. And that's when we said, well, there's contracts in place too. So we terminated the MOU. The RIO came back and they said, okay, why? So then I asked their director, can you go into a court of law and take jurisdiction of a case? And they thought about that for a second and they said no. And I knew that. I said, well, that's why you can't have an MOU, because you're not a government. You can't take jurisdiction. So then they said, well, what protects us? And that's wrong. It's not fair. And so I said, well, you have contracts, right? And they said, yeah. So I said, that's what protects you. We honor our contracts, and we also enforce contracts being honored. Both sides of it. They didn't like that answer, but it's the truth. It's the reality. And that's what those contracts are for. So I always make that distinction. 701 other purpose pieces, planning, funding of programs, and best practices revolves around everything we do. It's our middle name, I think, sometimes. 2006, our consultation process and our communication processes were formalized into protocols. They brought them before the 2006 Centennial Accord. Tribal leaders signed it, and the governor. So what that means is when we communicate with tribes, there's a formal process, dear tribal leader letter. And that also goes hand in hand with the communication protocol, how it actually functions. So we have lots of meetings through 701. Tribes, RIOs, yes, they happen everywhere and anywhere. Indian Policy Advisory Committee meets twice a year, January and July. And within the advisory committee, we do a lot of work group activities, and it's around specific issues. And this is really where we take advantage of getting the tribes involved and getting their feedback as partners. It's pretty cool. So with that process, we send out Dear Tribal Leader letters, rather signed. So they're signed by whoever is initiating that activity. Is it the secretary? Is it an assistant secretary? Whoever that is, they sign the letter, or it's me. Maybe something coming from me. We send it out to tribal leaders. We copy that letter or that communication. We digitize it, rather, and so it's emailed to tribal delegates. Each tribe appoints 2 delegates to IPAC. So one is an actual delegate, the other is an alternate. And so they meet with us. They carry information back to their councils, to their communities, but they also bring us information and direction. And that's how this works. And it's worked well. So from our efforts around 701, we have a lot of best practices. Production. You can find this DCS over under the Economic Services Administration has a lot of stuff online. So do the other administrations. So if you Google them and you look at what they got, there's a whole body of work here that's been created over time and maintained. Within our agency contracts database, the ACD, we track contracts, IGAs, MOUs, all of that's in there, or it's supposed to be. So consultation, it's the core, it's at the core of what we do. And those are the criteria primarily. And only the secretary, tribal government, or IPAC, Indian Policy Advisory Committee, can request consultation. This is the protocol. Well, goes into more detail than this, but it actually lays out how we how we respond, refer to tribal leaders, dear tribal leader. And so the pieces that we talk about in our communications and consultations too, contracts, contract amendments. Yeah, actually all of these. We don't do a lot of site visits anymore. We used to do it more when DBHR was here. There was a lot of site visits going on, but it's not as much now. But we do everything else that's on there. And this is the communication protocol. Here we go. So we have addressing to chairpersons and RIAL directors. And then the consultation protocol. So we have a consultation process that involves roundtables, an actual consultation itself. And when we're dealing with a given issue, we really take it apart, look at all the pieces as best we can, and come out of it with a decision and action. Here we are. This is the future. So as I noted earlier, let's see, there's a question here. Is the Northwest Urban Community, let's see, NIU, I don't know about that. Rebecca, no, they're not a RIO. They never were. But I'm sure they're still active. They were in Olympia. Yeah, I never heard of them, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. I don't know everything. I'll be the first to say that. No, our RIOs are Seattle Indian Health Board, United Indians of All Tribes Foundation, Chief Seattle Club. Those are all in Seattle. Native Project, the Indian Center in Spokane, and then we have Stowe and SPIPA. And they're located in Region 3. So anyhow, if you Google this name though, you'll probably find them. It sounds familiar. So 2009, Healthcare Authority was born, peeled away from DSHS, and they took their resources at that time, their programs. The promise was that the Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery, DBHR, would join them soon after. So that soon after turned into like 7 or 8 years later, but they finally got there. Okay, so anyway, we had Healthcare Authorities born. 2016 comes along, 2017, and Blue Ribbon Commission did its work, and so DCYF was born. Children's Administration peeled away from DSHS to join early learning at DCYF and launching services, and they did that. And so a year later, JR peeled away, and there's a couple other pieces that went with them, but they became part of DCYF. And so what that meant, so before all this happened, let's go back to 2008. Everything was more or less under DSHS or social services. And so they started breaking these pieces off. And instead of one major one-stop shop, really, DSHS, now there's three silos, 3 big silos too. They started scheduling their meetings, different meetings, conflicts, confusion, frustration. And so tribes started working on a model that would eliminate those 3 silos, really. That's really what it is in a nutshell. And this is what they came up with. And so what it does is it takes the IPAC model and elevates it to the governor's level, governors and tribal leaders. So this is the Tribal Leaders Social Services Council that you see in front of you. This is what we're doing in the future. And so twice a year, and that's twice a year, that's where we've eliminated those 2 IPAC meetings. We used to have 4, and we have 2. So twice a year, this group convenes, and one of those meetings is the day before the Centennial Accord. So we come together, we prepare an agendas, and we bring our issues to the governors and tribal leaders level. So down here, you see these social services work group, justice advisory, healthcare advisory work groups. Everything that we're doing today in our subcommittees and our other committee work, because we have our sister agencies, it folds under these work groups. So all of our subcommittees fold under our social services advisory work group. And what does that mean? So where we have issues coming before these work groups to resolve, and it involves collaboration between tribes and all of us, all these agencies and more, where we cannot find a solution or agree to a solution, or more importantly, have the authority to implement a solution, that gets elevated up to the governors and tribal leaders level, and they work on it. And that may be involved legislative fix or something that they do at their level. And so that's what happens. They can also send stuff down to us, and they do that. So the body of work we're doing right now is we are figuring out, we're defining these work groups and what they actually do. That's going to be what we do the next couple of years. It's pretty exciting. So beyond that, we're all involved. We're present at meetings, we're participating, we're solving problems. We're not doing this in a silo setting as we have before. And so that's really the brief overview of this. As we go through time more and more, it's going to become even more effective. It's not right now, but we're excited about what it can provide. So, yeah, looks like I'm going to give you some time back, because that concludes my presentation. This is my team. So if you have any questions, you need, there's no dumb questions, okay? My door's always open. You can reach me, send me a message, or reach out to my managers. They're in the regions. They're right there. We are here for you as resources, and that's what I'm saying. So just let us know, and we'll be there for you. So does anyone have any questions or anything they want to comment on? This is your time. And I want to thank you too for being so attentive. You know, you could have grilled me some more though. Wouldn't hurt my feelings. I like hard questions. So anyhow.
Tim, one quick question.
Yes, sir.
The issue about paying taxes and becoming citizens, I didn't catch all that.
Well, we pay taxes and we're citizens. And before 1924, we weren't, and we didn't. So to become citizens, we actually had to pay taxes.
Like income tax?
Yep.
The illegally unratified income tax? But I won't go there with you.
Yeah, because you know, we have to go back to when they created that law that wasn't signed by all the states, which means is it ratified, that amendment? You know, there's a lot of questions around that because not all the states signed it.
And then one other question. So then can tribes, if they're sovereigns, do they have a passport?
Well, they can, and but they have, so tribal ID cards, those are federal documents. And I have one from, I'm Flathead, Salish Kootenai, and I've used it to go across the border to Canada. You know, and then I have my Washington State ID, which is like, it's like a passport, it's enhanced. So I come back on that. But I couldn't use my tribal ID. They wouldn't honor it to get back. You're welcome, Chris. So Anything else? You guys have been quiet. Didn't you get enough coffee today? Oh, maybe you should get a double shot. Well, I want to thank you, and I'm really thankful for the work we've done together. You know, most of my my home skillets from back in the day are up there in the north end, Northwest Regional Council. Becky Bendixson and those folks, they still laugh at me and call me names, but it's all good. All right, y'all. Well, if there's no other questions, I'll get out of your hair, and I just want to thank you, and just keep chugging on, keep doing the great stuff you do.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. Really appreciated it.
Don't work too hard either. So I can leave, and it's not going to mess up your stuff, right? You're good.
Nope. I'm going to go ahead and end it, and that'll just stop the recording at that time. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
You too.